Hi, Kathy here again. This week we're moving on from the Renaissance to what came later. We'll start in Italy, our ground zero for this class, and what could be more Italian than Michelangelo's David, as we explore two art movements now known as Mannerism and the Baroque, which followed and responded to the High Renaissance. Art movements tend to get their names in retrospect, of course. No painter or sculptor or architect ever went into their studio and said to themselves, I think I'll be a Mannerist from here on out. But I can imagine artists in the 16th century going into their studios and shaking their heads in despair. What do you do as an artist when Raphael has already done this? What new pinnacle of perfection can be reached when someone as gifted as Leonardo or Michelangelo or Raphael has turned their gifts and energies into these kind of idealized images of human perfection? Raphael, alas, didn't have to worry about it. He died young in 1520, and that's very likely part of the reason art historians say that the High Renaissance ends at about that year. Michelangelo, however, was lucky enough to live long enough to have to grapple with this question every day. I'm sure he could have had a brilliant career simply repeating the kinds of sculptures he created in the David and the Moses, and yet, as we've already seen, he didn't. Michelangelo was experimenting with his non finito technique, even by the time he created the tomb sculptures for Giuliano de' Medici, remember? And we've looked at some others as well. He took that technique farther, and he didn't stop there. By the time he began work on his own unfinished tomb sculpture, he was experimenting very freely with unrealistic scale changes between his figures. And in this late Pietà, we see him changing the way he interprets the figure even more drastically, making it much less realistic, much more expressive. The fact is, there's a limit to how perfectly realistically an artist can reproduce something, and when the artist gets very close to that limit, things can start to get even a little boring, perhaps. It was obviously exciting for these young sculptors and painters to stun the world with the perfection of their skills, but to Michelangelo anyway, perhaps it wouldn't have been exciting to do that over and over for the rest of his days. Siena-born artist Massimo Lippi puts it into words beautifully, saying that modern and contemporary art began with this piece, the Pietà Rondanini. And this is a quote: Michelangelo could feel the end of an era was near. His superior talent could not submit to the canons set by academies. He reinvented everything. In the Pietà Rondanini, the rules of making art are surmounted by an instinctual power that was a final, direct, and definitive confrontation between a soul and God. In his architecture, too, Michelangelo was clearly seeking a way past the perfect stability and clarity of his early, classically inspired work. I said we'd come back to this vestibule for the Laurentian Library, and yes, let's look at it again. Does it strike you as deeply odd that a room should exist with nothing in it but a staircase? Here's the floor plan. This is the reading room of the library here, and this is that staircase room, the vestibule. There's nothing else in this room but the gigantic staircase. I suppose it's ostentatious, and perhaps that was part of the point, that his Medici patrons could afford to build a room that had literally no function, but was just a way to get into the next room, the reading room. But that's not all that's going on here. Remember Vitruvius, the Roman architect, whose ideas on the proportions of the human body Leonardo illustrated in that famous drawing? Vitruvius laid down some rules for architecture, and Michelangelo breaks them here. The pediment above this door, this triangular shape here, instead of being a perfect, stable triangle, it has a chunk cut out of it. The pilasters on the wall niches, they're blind windows, really. They get smaller as they taper downwards, rather than the other way around. Michelangelo is turning them upside down, in other words. The scroll-shaped brackets here on the wall, here you see a bunch of them, they should be supporting something, but they're used simply decoratively, as if Michelangelo is saying, I like the looks of these classical features and I can use them wherever and however I want, whether they're needed or not. Strangest of all are the columns inset into the wall. Perhaps it doesn't look strange to our jaded eyes, but this is the first time such a thing had been seen in architecture. In ancient Rome, even engaged columns, in other words, columns that were growing out of the wall behind them, like these columns here on the Temple of Portunus in Rome, they would have projected out from the wall, visually proclaiming their separate identity from the wall. So to have the columns almost hidden inside the wall like that was very strange to 16th century eyes. And the staircase itself flows like a waterfall, or as some have said, like a lava flow from the upper floor of the next room, becoming the closest thing to a sculpture in itself that a functional staircase could be. Another sculptor who was starting to make free with the classic tradition was Giulio Romano, a former assistant to Raphael, who came north to work under the patronage of the powerful Gonzaga family in Mantua. His design for Gonzaga's Palazzo del Te takes similar liberties to Michelangelo's Laurentian staircase. He uses huge keystones. You see them above these blank windows in the design of the courtyard. But like Michelangelo's scroll-shaped brackets, keystones aren't necessary here. Keystones are only needed in arches. There's just one real arch here in this whole place, but it has a pediment over it, which was a no-no in the Vitruvian rules of architecture that had been so admired and so carefully respected during the High Renaissance. And what's with this central stone kind of slipping down between each of the pairs of columns? You see that? Such a thing would never have been done in the classic world or in the Italy of only a decade previous to this. It makes it look as if the whole thing is about to fall down. At least it would have done to the eyes of Giulio's contemporaries. It's hard for us to see the building with their eyes. Our eyes are too used to the novelties of architecture that assault us every day. But for Giulio's wealthy patron, this subversion of tradition in such an ostentatious building was modern, sassy, hip, if you will. Right? Inside the building, Giulio broke more rules. His teacher, Raphael, would have been spinning in his grave, I'm sure, to see this painting. This fresco in the Room of the Giants in that same palazzo features a mythological theme, the gods expelling the giants from Mount Olympus. Giulio gives us the opposite of that stable, serene, high Renaissance composition. This is a cataclysm of motion and collapse. The ceiling, with its trompe-l'oeil dome, the dome isn't really part of the structure, it's just painted on the ceiling, uses all the skill of any high Renaissance artist, but to completely different ends. Giulio is not the painter Raphael was by a long chalk, but the fact that he trained with Raphael and yet could produce works so different in spirit within a decade of Raphael's death shows how rapidly the mood of the time was changing. Notice, too, that like the artists of the High Renaissance, Giulio still took it for granted that he could work in both architecture and painting. There wasn't the specialization then that has come in our time. Can you imagine nowadays a painter being commissioned as the architect of a building? Let's look at some more painting to try and clarify for you the difference in spirit between Mannerism and the High Renaissance that preceded it, in Italy in particular. Artists who are now recognized as unique individual geniuses, remember, they loved the techniques of the Renaissance but wanted to use them for more distinctive, personal, expressive ends. So we'll see many of the techniques like sfumato, chiaroscuro, accurate perspective, but used on subject matter and in compositions that are really different. Pontormo, one of my favorite painters of this period, is an early example. His work still retains some of the simplicity of approach of Masaccio or Michelangelo, but his composition and color are entirely different from theirs. His forms swirl around and interlock, intertwine in a composition that expresses the agitation of the descent from the cross with an extremely personal sensitivity. Grief, but grief that is rhythmic and in motion. His color, too, is like no one else's. Pale pinks and greens, oranges and blues. The figure holding up Jesus' legs down here is almost iridescent with these cool secondary highlights against these warm skin tones. Very unusual color. Here's a visitation, a traditional religious subject again, Mary visiting St. Anne to let her know she is pregnant. This was photographed in 2018, fresh from being restored, so you can see just how vivid Pontormo's color is. Even in the simpler composition, you still see something of the intertwining poses that Pontormo was famous for. By this point, classical mythology was well established as appropriate subject matter for painting. Correggio's Jupiter and Io gives us a pretty good idea as to why. This Titianesque composition illustrates a story from Ovid of one of Jupiter's many seductions, this time disguised as a cloud. Io swoons appreciatively in his cloudy grasp. In a frankly erotic scene, you can sort of see Jupiter's face right here in the emerging from the cloud and his bear-like cloudy arms sort of pawing at Io there. We've come a long way here from Botticelli's first ventures into mythology, like the birth of Venus, right? And in a very short time. And Correggio did a whole series on the loves of Jupiter, all the different people Jupiter disguised himself in order to seduce or kidnap. They were big money makers for this very skilled painter. If Pontormo owes something to Michelangelo, Correggio certainly owes much to Leonardo. You can see that similar wonderful sfumato, but Leonardo would never have painted a composition like this. Mannerism, frankly, catered to the refined tastes of wealthy patrons. So more and more, ideals of beauty no longer repeated the classic patterns, but experimented with unusual proportions and figure types that emphasize grace and sometimes are rather elongated. Compositions got more complex as tastes became more sophisticated. No longer was mere clarity or stability considered a worthy goal. Originality became more important, since individual creative geniuses have to make their mark with work that only they could do. Bronzino, for example, has yet a different approach, with a vision of ideal beauty that is polished to a high finish. His portraits, like this one of Eleonora de Toledo and her son Giovanni de' Medici, set the precedent that soon became the standard for court portraiture throughout Europe. The idealized high society model, the serene and rather remote, even cold pose, the rich garments painted in exquisite detail. Bronzino also painted mythological subjects too, and in these his Mannerist approach to composition is much more pronounced. This allegory of Venus, besides being fairly erotic in its own odd way, you'll have noticed that by now mythological has become a sort of code word for erotic. It's also packed with symbols that even now art historians love to argue the meanings of. Everywhere you look, you see objects, creatures, a lot of other people besides just Venus, Cupid, folly, and time. This composition is as complex and roiling as any Pontormo or Giulio Romano. Okay, I feel like I need a drum roll here. I know you've been wondering where the women artists are, and believe it or not, this period finally brings us to not just one, but several female artists. Our first is one of the finest, Sofonisba Anguissola. Anguissola was from Cremona, a mid-sized city in northern Italy, and we'll see that this is something of a pattern in the women artists we're about to look at. It may be that a smaller city, which did not have quite the cultural reputation of a Florence or a Rome, gave these very early women artists a bit more space to cultivate their talents and thrive. Though Anguissola did not have an artist father, as several other women artists did, she had an unusual one for the times. Her father insisted on the same humanist education for his daughters as for his son, and he valued the arts. Here he is in a fairly early painting of Anguissola's. Thanks to his advanced views on female education, 4 of his daughters ended up becoming accomplished painters. But Sofonisba was head and shoulders above the rest. Here's a painting she did at 17 or 18 years of age. It's a painting of her teacher, Bernardo Campi, doing a painting of her, sort of a meta self-portrait. I invite you to admire the skill that could render these 2 likenesses with the subtle differences between them that show one is meant to be a living portrait, the portrait of Campi, and one, her own, to be a painted one, though both are painted, of course. Anguissola went to Rome in her early 20s, where her proud father sought out Michelangelo to consult on her talent. The master gave her one of his drawings to copy, but set a task for Anguissola. She was to send him a drawing of a crying boy, a subject he apparently considered challenging. She sent him this drawing, again, of her brother and sister. She drew her family a lot, since as a woman, she had no other options. This drawing so impressed Michelangelo that he eventually gave it as a gift to one of his closest friends, who later gave it along with a drawing by Michelangelo himself to Cosimo de' Medici. It's certainly a beautiful drawing, but one suspects that the fact that it was drawn by a young woman gave it a certain extra interest, as an oddity, perhaps, as well as a skillful drawing. Michelangelo continued to give Anguissola his drawings to copy and advised her on her work for a couple of years. Despite her unusually good education and connections, Anguissola was limited in her subjects because, as a woman of the upper class, she could not draw from nudes or study anatomy. So her work is mostly confined to portraiture, at which she clearly excelled. In 1560, she was invited to the court of Spain by the Queen Elizabeth, where she became a portrait artist to the court. Anguissola worked there for decades, finally returning to Italy, where, married to a wealthy merchant and receiving a pension from the King of Spain, she was able to paint to her heart's content until her eyesight failed her in her late 80s. She lived to be 93, and even those last 5 years when she couldn't paint, she used her wealth to patronize other artists and consulted with young artists on their work and careers. Anthony van Dyck, a young Flemish artist who would go on to a very distinguished career as a court portrait painter in England, painted this sketch of Anguissola in her 92nd year. Along with his sketches of her, he made notes of some of the advice she gave him about painting, and said that his conversation with her taught him more about the true principles of painting than anything else in his life. If Anguissola could do that for a young man, just think of how much her career must have encouraged other women. The next painter we're going to look at, Lavinia Fontana, wrote in a letter in her 20s that it was seeing one of Anguissola's portraits that had made her set her heart on learning how to paint. As you see from this self-portrait, Lavinia Fontana was also a gifted portrait painter, likely for similar reasons. Fontana lived in Bologna, like Cremona, another mid-sized city to the north of Florence. Fontana's father was a painter, so she had the advantage of a professional studio in which to learn her skills. Fontana was quite successful with a network of noble women patrons who bought her portraits like this one and religious paintings like this. She employed her husband, a painter himself who had also been a student of her father's, in painting the draperies of her figures and helping care for their 11 children. Just have to mention those 11 children, something Raphael and Leonardo apparently didn't have to worry about. Fontana seems to have been a completely remarkable person in an unusually modern marriage. Besides supporting her large family with a very successful painting career, she earned a doctorate from the University of Bologna, no easy feat in itself for a woman in the 16th century, and spent the last years of her career in Rome, where she was invited by the Pope to come and paint portraits for his ecclesiastical court. One interesting fact is that she, apparently the first among women artists, also painted some nudes. Only female nudes, but still, even female nudes were generally considered off limits to women artists of this period. Some historians believe she must have had family members model for her, and some even suggest that her father provided her with studies for the nudes, which seems somewhat less expert than her portraits. But either way, she still courageously acted on a belief that the nude figure was a possible and appropriate subject for a woman painter. That couldn't have been easy. My hat is off to Lavinia Fontana. For context, I'll just remind you again of the way male artists were painting nudes at the time. Titian, for example, with works like Danae, another visit from Jupiter to a nymph, this time disguised as a shower of gold coins. Not very easy to see in the center of the painting here. Titian's painting is quite a bit earlier, about 1545. Minerva dressing, the Fontana painting, came late in Fontana's career in 1613. But Fontana apparently did not find that the passing of the decades had freed her up to paint a nude nymph in the act of being seduced. Fontana chooses to depict the goddess of wisdom, chastely turning away from us and putting her clothes on rather than a steamy seduction. I love Titian, don't get me wrong, but you may want to think back on these differences in the opportunities open to women artists and the attitudes towards women artists at this period as we look further this week at historical depictions of the nude. Let's look at another woman artist. Now that I've finally got started, it feels so great to be showing you the work of these amazing, groundbreaking women. Here's another, a sculptor this time, also from Bologna, Properzia de' Rossi. She was a noblewoman who received a relatively good education, but she did not have an artist father, as Fontana did. Having an artist father was the best way for a woman to get access to a studio and training, since women could not take part in the apprentice system by which male artists learned their craft. She had to learn to carve marble however she could, and she must have been a very determined soul. I've tried carving marble back in art school, and it's very hard work. Back in those days before power tools, it must have seemed an extremely daunting field for a woman to enter. Properzia de' Rossi studied drawing under a master engraver and studied at the University of Bologna as well. She had a very tough life. Vasari, remember Vasari, who included her in his lives, says she was, quote, paid a beggarly price for her work. And even when she began to win important commissions, a male artist named Amico Aspertini apparently worked to damage her reputation and career. De Rossi died owing money to a plague hospital, bankrupt and alone in her 30s, having struggled to achieve some real success and reputation, but sadly, between illness and professional envy, getting apparently little opportunity to really enjoy it. Before we leave the period of Mannerism, I'd like to look at two more artists, back to some male artists now for a bit, who were quite different painters from each other, but are united in the fact that both were avid disciples of Titian. The first is Tintoretto, a Venetian who was inspired by the energetic style of late Titian and late Michelangelo. Remember that these two high Renaissance artists lived long lives, and by the end of their careers, they were moving towards a Mannerist approach themselves. We've just looked at some of Michelangelo's later work, in which his high Renaissance idealism gives way to a more personally expressive style, and a similar thing can be seen in some of Titian's later work, like this Pietà, where instead of the high finish of that nude we just looked at, the Danae, we see the impact of this painting coming much more from the drama of the composition and the very free expressive handling of the paint. The large areas of trompe-l'oeil, sculpture, and architecture here painted in grisaille, and the almost frantically rapid strokes rendering these outer figures seem like a funnel pulling us into the still center of Mary's face as she looks at her dead son. That's Titian, now his student Tintoretto. Tintoretto certainly learned Titian's underpainting and glazing techniques, but his individual style really reflects the influence of that later work of Titian's. It's very dependent on rapid, energetic execution. His contemporaries even made fun of how fast Tintoretto painted, equating his rapid brushstrokes with a lack of finish or carelessness. And you can imagine that it was a bit unsettling after the high finish of the High Renaissance. There was a practical aspect to his speed of working, too. He had a very active studio with lots of commissions to produce. His way of working on a painting like this was to create a tiny model of the scene he wanted with wax figures. He would even build the little room like a tiny stage set and light it to his satisfaction. Then he stretched strings across it on a frame to make a grid and used that grid to transfer an exact drawing to his much larger gridded canvas. From there, he had his assistants block in the basic colors of the painting, and then he would return to the canvas to finish the figures and add other detail. Tintoretto is a fascinating painter to me, perhaps the first painter we've looked at who glories in letting us see his individual brushstrokes, as in these angels here who float transparently around the ceiling. This Last Supper, painted nearly a century after Leonardo's famous Last Supper, seems to come from an entirely different world. Stability is the last thing this composition is about. It uses linear perspective for drama rather than, as Leonardo did, for clarity. Tintoretto gives us a clutter of servants, animals, angels, and his Christ is only distinguished by the brightness of his halo. If that weren't there, it might be pretty tough to even tell which figure is Christ. The exact center of the composition is occupied by the bread and wine, symbols of transubstantiation, a central doctrine and sacrament of the Roman Catholic Church. This painting may almost hide Christ in the crowd, as we saw Bruegel do, remember? But this painting is unapologetically Catholic, reinforcing the doctrines of a church responding to the siege of Protestantism in Northern Europe. And speaking of artist fathers allowing women a chance to become painters, Tintoretto employed his family in his workshop among his other apprentices, and 4 of his 8 children ended up becoming artists themselves, including his oldest daughter, Marietta, who became quite well known in her day as a portrait painter. Though she never struck out on her own, she stayed in her father's workshop, working so skillfully with the techniques he had taught her that art historians have difficulty telling their work apart. The other disciple of Titian that I want to look at is Domenicos Theotokopoulos, called El Greco. I'm grouping him with the Italians because of his training with Titian, though, like Sofonisba Anguissola, he spent much of his professional career in Spain. El Greco came to Venice to study with Titian from the island of Crete off the coast of Greece. El Greco means the Greek, of course. And he absorbed the work of the other Italian Renaissance and Mannerist masters while he was studying with Titian. El Greco's work does not aim for idealism or stability. It aims for expression, an exalted spiritual state, even mysticism, in my opinion. For me, his work has something of the feeling I get from Grunewald, the feeling that he is using form and color to express a spiritual vision. In his burial of Count Orgaz, the scene is divided between heaven and earth. So heaven up here and earth very clearly down here. In the bottom part, 2 saints have miraculously appeared to tenderly lower the Count's body, you can see them here, into the sarcophagus. And in the top, an angel carries his tiny, transparently painted little soul up to heaven, where the figures are painted much more dynamically and less substantially than the men down on the earth, as if in his very painting style, El Greco is showing us their divinity. This painting is installed, as you see here, right over the stone plaque representing the front of the Count's actual sarcophagus. So it feels like not just a painting, but almost a reenactment of his burial. He's being placed into his literal tomb there. Here's El Greco's view of Toledo, one of my favorite landscapes. When you go to Toledo to see his work, as I know you will want to, the bus takes you right up this hill, and though the view is obviously a bit different today, you'll recognize it from the painting. Such a different response to a landscape than that of the High Renaissance, right? Instead of a misty, distant, idealized view intended to extend the spatial depth of a portrait, this landscape is painted for itself alone. It's absolutely specific. It dances with life. It confronts the viewer with its own personality and spirit. First landscape like this that I can think of in the history of the world. I think El Greco came to love Toledo. He made it his home, at any rate, and had a successful career there, though he did not achieve the success he hoped for. His work puzzled many of his contemporaries with its swirling compositions and thin, attenuated figures. In particular, it did not meet with the favor of Philip, the King of Spain. That's probably part of why El Greco spent the rest of his life in Toledo rather than moving to the capital, Madrid, to work at court as he had apparently hoped. His completely individual approach to painting, though, has made him a favorite of modern painters and art lovers. It really puts him a bit outside of any artistic school, which is a badge of honor to the modern eye. I love his work, and I hope you will get to see it in person someday. This presumed self-portrait is in New York, the Met, so not as hard to see as many of the things we're looking at. Because the term Mannerism denotes more of a reaction to the Renaissance than any specific consistent style, the work of Mannerist artists can look quite different from each other. Some may still be fairly conservative and Renaissance-like, especially for portraiture. Others are deliberately breaking rules to create a sort of signature look that defies or subverts old conventions. Some, like Tintoretto or El Greco, challenge themselves to find their own authentic way of working rather than repeat the triumphs of the Renaissance over and over. That's why those two artists in particular have so much to say to me personally. In other words, you probably won't feel that you like Mannerism or you don't like Mannerism, but you likely can respond to the work of particular artists within this period. I hope so, anyway. We're next going to just start looking, just in Italy for now, at an art movement that grows out of Mannerism, but has a much more distinctive set of traits. The Baroque. The word Baroque started out as a pejorative, an insult. It derives from the Portuguese word barroco, a term for a large, irregularly shaped pearl, and it suggests something that is extremely ornate and showy, maybe strange, maybe not in completely good taste, but the word has come to cover a period where high quality and technical virtuosity are really now unquestioned. Some of the world's greatest artists worked during the Baroque period, so of course there are a wide range of styles and approaches, but there really are a few things that are so characteristic of the Baroque that I want you to be looking out for them in the works we'll be looking at today and also next week. Emotionalism, theatricality, chiaroscuro, and effects of light, and the inclusion of the viewer. We'll start our look at the Baroque with three artists, all from Italy, beginning with the architect and sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini. In architecture, especially Italian church architecture, there was now a strong requirement that designs be emotionally appealing, opulent, even spectacular. The Roman Catholic Church, still reeling from the Protestant Reformation, which had conquered the soul of Northern Europe, was making its best effort to bring back the heretics and engage the faithful. In 1623, Vatican architect Bernini was given the job of creating an enormous, ornate canopy called a baldachin over the main altar in St. Peter's Basilica. This giant sculpture meets architecture has always stood out in my mind as a symbol of the Baroque. This view gives an idea of its scale because of the figure down here. Here's the whole thing. This may be the most complicated object I can even think of. It's got 2 or 3 different kinds of pillars, angels, putti, which are baby cherubs, Symbols of the Pope's family, honeybees, laurel leaves, suns. It's got everything. And still, it somehow manages to be strangely beautiful. When you stand in the cathedral, basilica, I guess is a better word, you may find yourself magnetically drawn to it. It's quite something. In between its pillars, here we see a view of the chair of St. Peter's, also designed by Bernini. It's a gilded encasement, really a reliquary, which Bernini made to cover the original wooden relic, the chair that was supposed to belong to the first St. Peter and which symbolized the church's authority descending directly from Peter himself. Again, it's really a reliquary sculpture. 4 theologians lift the chair up to be received by more angels and putti against the backdrop of a stained glass window which pours light onto the gold. A very effective theatrical piece. That theatricality is such an important feature of the Baroque. Here's Bernini's sculpture of St. Teresa of Avila in ecstasy, a mystic depicted at the moment of her ecstatic vision. It's emotional, yes, over the top emotional, but not with the quiet, contained emotion of Michelangelo's Pietà and St. Peter's, right? This is more like a performance of emotion. The descending rays of light, which are part of the sculpture, almost feel like a spotlight. And when you see it in its site in Santa Maria della Vittoria, the structure around it really completes the feeling of it being a performance on a stage. You can see even the sculptor Bernini working with light, both in these sculpted golden rays of light and the stained glass window he incorporated into the display of St. Peter's chair. For Baroque painters, light was even more important. It's now that chiaroscuro comes into its own as you've never seen it before. Our first painter is Caravaggio, who began his career selling painted scenes of street life models dressed as musicians or mythological subjects for sophisticated Roman collectors. These paintings tended to be more brightly lit and evenly lit, but even these already have a strong sense of chiaroscuro. Within a short time, as he became more well-known, Caravaggio worked more and more on religious commissions, and his lighting became extremely theatrical, really as if there were a spotlight on a stage set. In this scene of the calling of St. Matthew, we see Christ barely visible behind an unknown other figure. This is Christ pointing here. He's pointing dramatically to the tax collector who would become one of his apostles, St. Matthew. Matthew is sitting with a bunch of overdressed rich kids playing with money here. He's caught at this exact moment of tension. He echoes the gesture, pointing to himself. Me? Big sections of this painting and parts of many of the figures are lost in the rich, dark shadows. This deposition or entombment of Christ is one of my favorite Caravaggios. It features that same theatrical lighting which swallows up some of the figures, much of some of them, but it allows other parts to shine out against the dark background, a technique painters call lost and found contour. The startling perspective really draws the viewer right into the scene. We are apparently down in the grave, looking up at the figures who are lowering Christ's body to us. Nicodemus, remember him from the story? He's a standard character in Depositions, the guy who provided Jesus with a grave. He's looking directly at us, right out of the painting, making eye contact with us, almost seeming to ask us to lend a hand. You can see all the features of Baroque painting: emotionalism, theatricality, chiaroscuro, and inclusion of the viewer coming together at their most powerful in this work. Caravaggio, alas, died young. His was an unquiet spirit, often involved in violence and trouble with the law. He spent the last years of his life alternating between working on commissions and fleeing from reprisals against a murder which he committed and insults into which his violent temper had led him. He died from a fever while on the run from an enemy who had wounded him at the age of 36. Despite his tragic early death, Caravaggio became one of the most influential European painters. His prolific work showed other painters how to use naturalism and lighting to convey powerful emotion. The last painter we're going to look at today is one of his most important followers and a favorite painter of mine, Artemisia Gentileschi. Gentileschi's father was a well-known painter, hence she was able to get the training and resources she needed to become an artist herself. Here is her self-portrait as an allegory of painting, a standard iconographical symbol, a richly dressed woman with palette and brushes wearing a gold necklace that symbolized the interlocking chain of artists' achievements, which I'm sure you're all coming to appreciate. I suppose the one privilege that a female artist could have over males was to turn that female image of the art of painting into her own self-portrait. She earned it, too. She was born in Rome. She had a successful and prolific career that spanned Florence, England, and Naples. And it wasn't easy, as we'll see. Her father loved Caravaggio, and Gentileschi absorbed that influence well, as you'll see in her amazing use of chiaroscuro in particular. This is one of her most famous paintings, some of the most dramatic lighting we've seen in a painting yet, right? Look at the way the shadow of Judith's hand from the candle is cast over her face, partially obscuring her eye there. So dramatic. The story here from the apocryphal biblical book of Judith is that the wealthy and beautiful Judith is trying to save her city, which is under siege by the army of a general named Holofernes. So Judith comes to his tent one night with her maidservant, invites Holofernes to party with them, gets him drunk, and cuts his head off, saving the city. That thing the maidservant is pushing into her sack at the bottom of the painting, that's his head. This story, with its appealing emotional drama, was painted a lot during the Baroque, including by Caravaggio. But Gentileschi painted it several times. Here's an earlier version in which the two women are slightly farther along. They already have their head in their basket. Maybe they're looking back to make sure none of the soldiers are following them. And here's one in which both women are still hard at work, cutting the guy's head off, which I find particularly horrifying. He's still alive and not happy at all about the way his evening is going. Blood spurting everywhere. And these aren't her only beheadings. Gentileschi also painted Jael beheading Sisera from a similar scriptural story, and Salome receiving the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The number of beheadings Gentileschi painted, beheadings of men by women, note, has led some art historians to suggest that she was taking a bit of revenge against men in general. It was very public knowledge, even in her day, that Gentileschi was a rape victim. She was raped by a fellow artist, an older mentor with whom she was working on a project. And when he declined to marry her afterwards, her father insisted on a public trial. This ordeal sounds like it must have been at least as horrible as the original crime. Gentileschi was not only forced to testify in public, but was tortured with thumbscrews to confirm her testimony. The thumbscrews did not get her to change her story, though, and her rapist was convicted, though his sentence, exile from Rome, was never carried out, never enforced. It was Gentileschi who ended up leaving Rome. She married a Florentine painter in a marriage hastily arranged by her father, and moved to Florence with him shortly after the trial, where she continued her successful career. Some other scholars have suggested that rather than some kind of psychic payback, Gentileschi, by painting these dramatic stories of strong women killing men, was getting what she could out of her notorious history, keeping it alive, even fanning the flames a bit to increase interest in her work. She certainly understood that she was painting in a man's world for male clients. She painted nudes, for example, both mythological subjects and the surprisingly many Bible stories that offer opportunities to show women in various states of undress. And of course, the most likely thing is that her motives were just complicated. She chose subjects that meant something to her, and she chose subjects that would appeal to her clientele and reinforce her image in their eyes. What's clear is that she was strong, self-disciplined, incredibly creative, and courageous, and did so much to open the field of painting to women. I'm grateful to her and a bit in awe of her. So we'll end our time in Italy with this Gentileschi self-portrait. Next week, we'll be moving outwards through Europe to see how the Baroque looks in Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands. I'll see you then.